In this part, I want to talk about some specific research I did and another aspect of it about the way that some young people chose poverty. Um, but I'm going to kind of do a little bit of background first. So, as I've been saying throughout the course so far, that youth unemployment and stuff like that has been relatively entrenched. It's improved a little bit more recently after the pandemic and the like, but still it tends to be double, if not triple, of the general rate. And there's also lower rates of pay for young people, much more higher rates of casualisation, precarity, and all that kind of stuff. So this casualisation, upward credentialising tends to affect young people more than the broader population. It affects the older part of the population at a higher rate as well. In the middle, not so much, but still it's affecting everyone in the labour market. So what's important here to remember too is that the binary such in unemployed and employed now are increasingly simplistic. People sometimes have 2, 3, 4 jobs and still don't have enough hours to be able to kind of get by and lead the life they want to live and pay for the things that they need. This has been more so the case when it comes to the rise of the gig economy that we'll talk about in terms of the future of work. The youth studies literature has also pointed out how young people in their plannings for the future tend to separate the notion of job and career. They particularly look for a thing like a job just to get by, particularly while studying or to kind of while they're trying to work out what they want to do, and often have notions of a career almost in a separate realm as a way of kind of leading to something in the future. So what I'm looking at here is a very specific, I suppose, cohort of people that have been active in punk and DIY creative scenes. Often they've invested in going to university or getting the job, moving up, various ladders or whatever. I've realized, particularly in their mid-20s, that it doesn't seem to feel like it's worth it, that it's hard to make the money you need to, particularly in places like Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane, and increasingly Newcastle, to be able to, say, buy a house. They realize that maybe they'll never be able to do that. So they downsize their kind of career aspirations and concentrate more on their creative aspirations. So this very much speaks to the notion of DIY career. There's a whole special issue of the journal Cultural Sociology on this, that one of the papers that's reading this week is from. DIY careers therefore utilise subcultural knowledges, practices and tastes that blur the lines between leisure and work, seeing young people move between a complex and non-linear combination of informal and formal work, between employment, underemployment and employment, and between education, leisure and work. And you can see how something like DIY careers therefore very much kind of useful for helping us think about that kind of blurry transition. It doesn't happen in a linear fashion as much anymore. So what I'm looking at here is the kind of, as I said, these deliberate decisions to opt out of kind of the mainstream rat race, is what they often referred to it as, where they have spent kind of their teens and stuff like that investing in the kind of subcultures and scenes that they're really interested into in a leisure way, at the same time trying to kind of create a career on the other sense. And realize that these two things can't really mix, and there's a kind of false promise of the career anyway, that you can never earn enough to kind of meet your needs or be able to pay for all the things that you desire. So the people that I'm talking to here are opting out and kind of, as they put it, sometimes choosing poverty. This is done in a reflexive way, where they know that in the future they're never going to have lots of money, that they're going to have to lead quite modest and small lives, but they accept this as a kind of, I suppose, payoff for being able to do the things they actually want to do. And so this kind of, again, leads to those kind of grey areas between employed, unemployed, and underemployed. I'm interested in this work about kind of what are the motivations for this. Is it sustainable? And I kind of discussed that in the first part of the lecture. That's kind of risky in many respects. And what kinds of entrepreneurship and what kinds of forms of self-investment kind of are necessary for this to happen. So we can trace here the trajectory from leisure practice to hobbyist, but then it goes further than what Rogers talks about in that paper, to kind of thinking about how people can kind of set up a business, but also the acceptance of various kind of what many would see as more negative aspects to be able to have that, freedom in inverted commas there. So the kind of conceptual lens of DIY careers has been developed in youth studies and bridges that gap between youth culture and youth transitions work. And I think I've been talking about Illusio in the course a little bit already. It's a kind of way of thinking about what motivations and what investments people make to make themselves happy, how those can be different, things that people need to do that can come into clash, and how we can then kind of choose one way of life over another to try and increase our flourishing and our well-being and our happiness. What's interesting about the people I'm talking about here is they're kind of very much rejecting mainstream kind of normative understandings that, more is better, earning more is better, having more stuff is better, all that kind of key consumerist stuff that we're kind of taught from an early age. These young people are kind of opting out of that and choosing other ways to kind of find satisfaction and creativity and happiness. So I kind of call this, in a sense, strategic poverty, and the way that these people negotiate these conflicting wants and needs and desires and pressures. So again, it's with the same research that I've been talking about the last couple of weeks in the ugly Australian underground, mostly up and down the East Coast. And these people were actively talking about, particularly the older cohort in the group, like from 25 to 30, rather than the kind of younger ones, that they were choosing poverty. And as one person said to me, they just like live a life where they deliberately keep overheads low. So in terms of what poverty means here, it's not homelessness, it's not kind of abject poverty, but it's often choosing, to continue to live in kind of share houses where there's 6 people, to live, a few suburbs more out, to, earn not a lot of money and therefore having to kind of strategize ways to kind of, get food relatively cheaply, use public transport cheaply and all this kind of thing. So all the people I'm talking about at the point of the interviews were definitely earning money below the poverty line, but it wasn't kind of abject extreme poverty. But they would talk about ways that the kind of more modest forms of living in this sense, particularly in a sense of doing it together with others, freed up these kind of temporal and emotional space to allow them to be creative. And quite often they'd quit pretty good, well-paying jobs, $80,000, $100,000 a year jobs to do this. So this kind of aligns with this notion of making do, and argues against much of the kind of dominant tropes of, mainstream economic society, that homo economics idea where we're all kind of rational decision-making decisions, kind of strategizing to have maximum utility and maximum profit. These people really much are not that kind of anthropological monster that Bourdieu calls homo economicus. They're making do. They reflexively know that they can't control everything. They're pushed and pulled around, but like they're trying, in a sense, to kind of create and make a life that's satisfying for them. Importantly here, the data that I'm kind of talking about, these young people argue that living an ethical life trumps living a kind of material life. And this actually, therefore, affects their attitudes towards the future as well. So I'm using the word precarity a lot, and I would say that, like, I'm not using precarity in terms of a class, the precariat, as Guy Standing talks about. I'm using it more of kind of structure of feeling, an effective atmosphere, kind of a way that people need to live today. Precarious kind of permeates the effective atmosphere of the fields that young people traverse in this kind of ever-lengthening, prolonged trajectory from school to work and beyond. So in this sense, the precariat is not a class per se, although most of the young people that I'm talking about would be in it if we were to define it that way. When I'm using the term precarity, I'm thinking more about the way things feel. As I've also mentioned previously, the young people here don't really want to work in the creative industries itself, an intensely precarious place to try and make a career. But they often kind of cross over into it and maybe take up some work in it every now and then. But like, they don't see themselves, or certainly do not refer to themselves as creatives, and have a kind of cynical attitude towards that kind of thing, particularly with the kind of internships and volunteer work and gig-based contracts and other kind of stuff that happens in that area. So there's a kind of, similar to the work of Angela McRobbie and others here, there's a drive to be creative, but they don't really want to do it as part of an industry. They want to kind of create a space, outside of that, or maybe just in terms of a small Venn diagram crossing over into it, where they can kind of do what they want to do. So in terms of some of the data that I collected, we're talking here to Fanny, who talks about her modus operandi is just to keep the overheads low. She works in a studio at a house. She has where she rents with many others. They go to the markets to buy food like twice a week, and they make kind of proper plans and budgets to do this, and to the point of like, getting recipes and doing it all properly and making sure they have the exact things they need to make over the next 2 weeks. They live in a kind of rundown place, but the landlord, as she says, is a bit of a rat, cuts a good deal, so they don't kind of bother him too much and they fix everything themselves. They keep the payments low, and then I like to be afforded the things I enjoy doing. And by that, she means her various creative endeavors that included bands and included painting. So she feels like the worst version of herself is when she has a full-time job. So by opting to kind of piece things together like this, she says she's afforded more freedom to do the stuff that makes her happy. So in this sense, there's a kind of sense of choosing poverty. Here we have Debbie. She talks about how it can be shit living in a share house. She's done it for many years, was doing music full time, felt like a burnout she wasn't doing in a job with a trade union. So she got out of that after a while, even though she was having a lot more money. But now in terms of having the space to make music and things like that, the payoff of not having much money is better for me at the moment. So you can see that she's reflexively talking about how this might not always be the case. She wants to have some space, and space here is a kind of, an artistic space, a freedom of kind of time away from kind of work. So the downside is she can't travel, she can't really have overseas holidays and stuff like that. She can't have mad outfits, buy lots of new funky clothes. But as she said, and this is referring to a job here, a previous job, either I'm going to end up 40 and burn out and not be able to produce shit, like make the stuff, be creative like she wants to be, or I'm going to have to live within small means. And she's good at that. She's pretty lucky, and, continue the punk ethic here. She talks about, I don't think I could get by unless I didn't learn how to shoplift. At the moment, it's worked out. I mean, I'm doing it for almost a year now, like working and living off crumbs and op shop living and just concentrating on getting better, playing and writing songs and stuff. Here's Asp talking about, we've talked about him before and the kind of struggles about the meaning of DIY. But I asked him, can you make a living out of being in 7 bands at once? And he goes, no, you can't really make a living. One has 6 people, one has 5, you get $300 for playing a gig at the Toad. It doesn't really go around. So it doesn't really work like that. But then what's interesting about this is that he claimed that he needs to actually work at least some days a week to have the means to be creative. He talked about how sometimes when he's got absolutely nothing to do, he's not working and trying to kind of do music every day, that it actually affects his creativity in a negative way. That work itself is a kind of way sometimes where you're away from being specifically creative. Obviously doing labor. I think he was working in a kind of fruit and veg kind of place. Allows him to kind of just kind of do this work, but think about what's going on and kind of come back and be able to kind of have better creative experiences. So there's a kind of interesting thing that goes on here, that some people are talking about getting rid of work completely. Some are kind of just downsizing. Some talk about how they need more space to be creative. Others talk about how you actually need to do a bit of, in inverted commas, real work, i.e. labor, to be able to kind of have a kind of, I suppose, distinction and have experiences and have feelings in a way to kind of be able to have the means to be creative. Another thing that came up a lot, and particularly like trying to get into the creative industries, is the kind of internships and volunteering. So Jemima talks here about like working as a chef flat out, trying to get internships to kind of get into the art industry, a gallery. She's been doing a bunch of that kind of stuff. She'd love to get a paid job, but they just don't seem to exist unless you kind of be able to kind of string this stuff together for years. And also you need to know the right people. So she's continuing to do this at the time of the gig, but she feels like there's no real future to it. And it often, as she points out in the last quote there, relies on other people having grant money. So again, this is kind of this project area in a way, like to talk about how you have to kind of gain experience by getting on other people's projects, and these things come and go, and it's really difficult. So she's trying at that time to stitch things together, her uni, her music, her internships, but it doesn't seem to be really going anywhere. This is Rain, who talked about how she's got a little jewelry studio at home. So Rain worked in the jewelry industry. She was working for a big multinational corporation making jewelry, but essentially she, after a while, realized that they were using, unethical diamonds and stuff like that. Really didn't suit her punk ethos. So she just really didn't want to be part of an industry that had blood diamonds, and she got out of it. Definitely wasn't an ethical job to have, and she was the only person in the company who was like, this is not good for my psyche. So she gets out. What she does then is kind of set up her own kind of DIY kind of craft business, uses things like Etsy and other digital affordances to start selling stuff, is building it up. Was at the time kind of at the point where she couldn't quite live off it. She was living with a partner who also had work, and they were piecing it together like that. But it's been hard to make money, as she says. Feels kind of silly throwing it in the bin, meaning all the kind of capital she's built up in the previous career. But she's now making her own stuff. I built this career, and now I don't even want it anymore. So you can see here the tensions and the kind of stresses that happen. Doesn't want to kind of sell blood diamonds anymore, but wants to remain kind of making jewelry and being creative. Rain also played in a bunch of punk bands, so obviously the kind of blood diamond thing didn't really suit that punk ethos, and makes a kind of punk ethos decision to get out of that industry and kind of do it herself. So what does kind of this mean in terms of notions of careers and choice? So I'm kind of theorizing this notion of illusio, different parts of your life have different motivations. You have to invest yourself in different ways. And in youth studies, I would say particular like choices about career have often been studies of kind of separately from the way people consume and create and things they do in their leisure practices. What this shows is like, people that develop a kind of punk spirit and living an ethical life in various ways in one part of their life can then kind of bring that stuff over to make decisions about that kind of more economic and material things. So there's a lot of kind of choices, necessity stuff going on here, I think, as well. The labour market is incredibly uncertain and precarious, and so setting yourself up in a career doesn't always work anyway. So there's a kind of playoff of making do and making some compromises and that kind of thing here. Moving down the very notion of kind of what success means away from material concerns and to more ethical concerns. So living an ethical life here trumps material concerns, projects a kind of ambivalent but hopeful attitude towards the future. So one of the readings this week is by Fiera. I won't go into it too much now, but I think it really unpacks aspects of this really well. Cutting-edge aesthetics may be seen as expressive forms of reaction, which allow them to announce their presence in the world. This just means that like some of those kind of efforts to be distinctive and resistive are still that, but also allows one to kind of express themselves in this kind of uncertain kind of sea of choices and all that kind of thing. So again, please read Fiera's work. It's in that paper. It's very worthwhile checking out to kind of contextualize some of the kind of more specific things I've been talking about today. To conclude, I've been talking about illusio, but there's kind of is a relation of cruel optimism here that Ballant talks about. Relations of cruel optimism exist when something you desire is actually an obstacle to your flourishing. And in a way, kind of the young people I'm talking to and about here realize this in their kind of mainstream careers and try and opt out to do something about it. What's interesting now, and I'd really like to do this, is go back almost 10 years later to see how they're doing and see if they've kind of remained in their alternate DIY careers or had to go back to a more normal thing. Hopefully I can do that in the future at some stage. But this tension and these examples highlight different kind of strategies that young people have to make do, to create a good sense of self in economic circumstances where that's increasingly difficult. Okay, I'll leave it there and come back and talk about youth and immaterial labour.